Hello and welcome everyone. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the dirty hands problem, which is coming from a paper from Walzer, sort of a famous paper from the standpoint of like philosophy and political science. So this is the problem of dirty hands, and I'm going to give sort of like a version. It's a really interesting paper, and there's a lot to kind of work through in it. I'm going to bring to life some aspects that I think are most relevant to our discussion here, but there's a lot more interesting things to kind of discuss with it. All right, so the problem of dirty hands gets its name from a reference to the Sartre play of the same name. And so the quote, "I have dirty hands right up to the elbows. I plunge them in filth and blood. Do you think you can govern innocently?" And Walzer says no. All right, so we want to think carefully in this. We want to think carefully in this lecture, in this video, in the paper, about our expectations for governance, and to the extent that our expectations are reasonable, unreasonable, what level of standards we want to hold elected officials to, and to what extent we are right or wrong for excusing possibly questionable behavior. And so that it's interesting. There's some subtleties to it, and my point here is I just want to kind of want to raise the issues and then have us reflect on it. I'm not advocating for excusing immoral behavior on the standpoint of elected officials, and I think everyone, other things equal, we want to uphold the highest standards. I want to raise the observation that sometimes there's some really complex issues that we need to work through when it comes to reality. And so that's something I want to think carefully about. All right, so we often do not believe those who govern are innocent. It does not mean that it's not possible to do the right thing while governing. It means that for a particular act of government, or governance might be exactly the right thing to do in the utilitarian terms, but yet morally wrong. Right? So there's this sort of tension between what's correct in the standpoint of the greatest good for the greatest number of people, but maybe and in between, like, what's moral, what's right and wrong. All right, so if we believe that politicians are morally worse than the rest of us, this suggests that the problem of dirty hands is a central feature of political life. It's maybe not the case the politician is unlucky, but it's a systematic and frequent occurrence, right? So maybe it's not that they're unlucky that they're in this bad sort of situation and had to do something wrong for the greater good. Could just be like this is how the system works. Interestingly, of course, we realize politicians are different. They have a claim to act on our behalf, even in our name, and are to pursue the good of the group. Right? That's sort of part of the goal. I mean, there's a similar calling, there's a similar expectation and belief for like medical providers. You expect physicians to be acting in the interest of their patient. Interestingly, there's some things to explore there relative to the motivations. Think of a principal agent problem, motivations faced by medical providers. All right, so anyway, but here we're talking about politicians. So politicians might lie or bend the rules, but this is for us, or so the story goes. Right? The politician also serves their own interests as well, though it's probably not possible to serve us without doing so. Right? The real realization being, it's probably not possible to serve strictly in the interest of us, of society, without also serving one's own interest. In some sense, politicians are thought to be worse than the rest of us because they rule over us. It's better to rule than to be ruled over. So we might say, well, there could still be good and decent people still entering political life with the best motivations, trying to achieve some reform. And as the story goes, maybe it's the case that to be successful, they have to learn from Machiavelli, learn the Machiavellian principle of how not to be good. Maybe to be able to be effective, they have to learn how not to be good, how to play the political game, as it were. They cannot do good themselves unless they win. They might need to be willing and able to use necessary means to win, even if these are potentially immoral. Also, there's a sort of like negative selection problem inherent in the process of assuming political power, where maybe it might signal proclivities, propensities towards bad behavior by virtue of the fact that they're running for office in the first place. Right? Sometimes it's right to try to succeed, and then it must also be right to get one's hands dirty. but to get hands dirty from doing what is wrong. The question is, like, how can it be wrong to do what's right? How can we get our hands dirty by doing what we ought to? Well, here's two examples. So we could say, well, in the first example, maybe it's just difficult to win elections without being corrupted in some sense. Maybe it's difficult to win an election without getting one's hands dirty, right? Suppose in order to win in the first place, the candidate needs to make a deal with some dishonest ward boss involving contracts for school construction over the next 4 years. Should they make the deal? Well, we could view the campaign a certain way and then view its importance. So maybe we hope the candidate overcomes their misgivings and actually makes the deal. This is interesting, right? We know the deal is wrong. We believe the candidate's good. We know they're doing right when they make the deal because they know they're doing wrong, right? We want them to make the deal anyway, even though it's wrong, because that makes them, it's what's necessary to get elected. And I think sometimes people actually feel this way, where you feel, okay, well, this candidate has taken money from particular interest groups, but we want them to do that even though we don't like that, because that's what's necessary for that person to be elected in the first place, right? Does that happen, right? I think it might. And maybe part of why we excuse this is because we believe that they recognize what they're doing is wrong and they feel bad about it. They feel some sense of remorse, but they realize that it's motivated by the greater good. Right? So the idea is the candidate makes the deal, feels very badly, which we want them to, feels guilty, believes themselves to be guilty. And this is what we mean by saying the candidate has dirty hands. There's a more extreme example. You can think of like a war example. So the politicians have pledged to peace after winning the election. It said, okay, no more wars. We're going to strive for peace at all costs. However, then suppose the newly elected leader faces a dilemma where they're called upon to roll back and go back on their promise for peace. Suppose they're asked to authorize the torture of a captured rebel leader who knows or might know the location of a number of bombs hidden in apartment buildings around the city set to go off in the next 24 hours. Politician who orders the torture is convinced that this is right for the sake of those who might otherwise die, even though they might want to maintain the belief that torture is wrong, not just sometimes, but always. So that's interesting, right? And you think really carefully, if they go ahead and they authorize the torture, now they've got dirty hands. They might have done this to save innocent lives, even while maintaining that torture wasn't the way to achieve that result. I don't know. So it's an example of like blurring the lines between right and wrong. So you think of like Jack Bauer. So here's Jack Bauer looking tough and looking possibly like Jack Bauer may have done something morally questionable that Jack Bauer has justified as being for the greater good. All right. This comes from 24, it was a really innovative show. At one point, that was a rabbit hole of binge watching that I got caught into because, you know, it's the entire series taking place in 24 hours, like whatever, however many 24 episodes or whatever. So it's a structure that makes continued watching, that incentivizes continued watching. So anyway, years and years ago. All right, so here's the moral politician. It's by their dirty hands that we're able to identify them. Right? It's by the fact that they're able to, they've done something, they regret it, they feel guilty. Right? Because if this is a moral person and nothing else, well, their hands wouldn't be dirty because they wouldn't have done it. They also might not be in that position. If they're a politician and nothing else, they would pretend their hands were clean. Right? They just look the other way, or they'd feel no guilt or remorse and just do it anyway. No doubt we get our hands dirty in private life as well. Sometimes we should. But it's the most dramatic in politics for three reasons. Firstly, the claim to act for others, but also to serve themselves. The fact that they rule over others, and the fact that violence might be used or threatened against society. So, so we think about our reflection here. Well, the deceitful and cruel politician is excused if they succeed, only in the sense that the rest of us come to agree that the results were worth it for the greater good, right? Or, more likely, we forget their crimes, or maybe crimes is strong. We forget their questionable moral actions when we praise their success. Political action is so uncertain, politicians necessarily take moral as well as political risks, right? They commit crimes that they think that they commit crimes that they only think ought to be committed. They override the rules without ever being certain that they found the best way to the results that they hope to achieve. And we don't want them to do that too quickly or too often. So now the reflection. So reflection on this paper and reflection on the ideas that Walzer raises, right? Do we always want to hold our officials to high moral standards? Possibly in light of the fact that real world situations are incredibly complex, may involve scenarios where it's more about choosing the least terrible from some set of bad choices. Do we want to permit our officials to make morally objectionable trade-offs? Right? It's an interesting question. If you take a step back, we've probably heard the phrase, the ends justify the means, or at least something similar. Can we, or maybe when can we, or be the case that certain outcomes justify otherwise morally objectionable actions to reach those ends? And how should we think of these moral dilemmas? How should we evaluate the decisions of those who are confronted by difficult moral dilemmas? Should we excuse when they've chosen a direction we believe is immoral so as to justify the means? Right? Do positive economic outcomes qualify as ends that can justify really bad means? That's interesting, right? In other words, can economic gain for the group justify hardship or pain to a smaller number? Right? We say in economics, especially with international trade or with other types of trade or policies, free trade, winners win more than the losers lose. But there's still losses to some individuals, and those losses are not offset to them when there's overwhelming gains for others, right? How should we evaluate the difficult economic decisions our politicians need to make pertaining to trade-offs involving, say, the funding of safety net programs or other forms of assistance versus other things we need, like defense and infrastructure? We think carefully about, can the economic gain for the group justify hardship or pain to a smaller number? Think about some of these subtleties, think about some of these complexities relative to applying some of these ideas in the standpoint of economics, and think about economic policy, think about policy more generally. This is an interesting question, and important to kind of reflect on and to think kind of carefully about some of these things we wouldn't ordinarily have thought about. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. Check out the paper and the link to the Walzer video right here. So anyway, I'll see you in the next video.